The night the storm arrived, it did not knock. It did not warn. It descended like a judgment written in ice, swallowing the sky, silencing the roads, and turning the world into a white, endless breath of cold. Wind screamed through the valley as if the mountains themselves were crying, and snow fell so thick it erased distance, memory, and hope in a single sweep. In a small village resting at the edge of that valley lived a poor man named Ion. He owned no land worth naming, no wealth worth counting, and no future that anyone else could see. His house was a fragile structure of wood and clay, stitched together by years of repair and prayer. It leaned slightly to one side, as if even it was tired of standing. Yet inside that weak shelter lived a man whose heart was stronger than stone. Ion survived on labor that broke his body and barely fed his stomach. By day he carried firewood from the forest. By night he patched torn clothes, sharpened tools, and whispered prayers into the darkness. His hands were cracked, his back bent, and his face lined far beyond his years. But his eyes still carried something rare. They carried patience. Winter had already been cruel that year. Snow had come early, stealing crops before harvest and freezing water in its pots. People with wealth shut their doors tighter and burned more firewood. People without it simply endured. Ion was one of them. He had stored little food, because little was all he ever had. Still, he shared what he could, believing that hunger felt lighter when carried with faith. On the evening the storm began, the sky darkened before sunset. Birds disappeared. Dogs stopped barking. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if gathering strength. Villagers rushed indoors, sealing windows and bolting doors. Ion stood outside for a moment longer, looking at the clouds rolling like black waves across the heavens. He felt the cold bite his skin and knew this storm would not be ordinary. He returned home and placed the last of his firewood into the hearth. The flame flickered weakly, struggling against the air creeping through the cracks in the walls. He wrapped his thin shawl tighter around himself and sat beside his mother, who lay wrapped in blankets, her breath shallow but steady. Age and illness had taken their toll on her, and winter was never kind to the old. As night fell, the storm unleashed itself fully. Wind howled like a living creature. Snow slammed against the walls, finding every weakness, every opening. The roof groaned. The door rattled. Cold pressed inward from all sides. Ion fed the fire sparingly, knowing the wood would not last the night if he was careless. Hours passed slowly, measured only by the sound of the storm and his mother's breathing. Hunger gnawed at him, but he ignored it. Cold crept into his bones, but he endured it. Patience, he reminded himself, was not the absence of pain. It was the decision not to surrender to it. Near midnight, when the storm was at its fiercest, a sound cut through the wind. A knock. Faint, uncertain, almost lost in the roar of the blizzard. Ion froze, unsure if his ears had deceived him. Then it came again. A knock, weak and desperate. No one traveled in such weather. No one sane, at least. Fear whispered to him to stay where he was. To protect what little warmth and safety he had left. To pretend he had heard nothing. But another voice spoke louder, one he had listened to all his life. It reminded him that hardship did not excuse hardness of heart. Ion rose, wrapped his shawl tighter, and moved toward the door. The wind forced itself inside as he opened it, carrying snow and ice like knives. Standing there was a man, bent under the weight of the storm. His clothes were thin, his face pale, his lips trembling. Snow clung to his hair and beard, and his eyes held the unmistakable look of someone standing at the edge of endurance. Without a word, Ion pulled him inside and shut the door. The stranger collapsed onto the floor, too weak to stand. Ion helped him sit near the fire, though the warmth was meager. He brought the last of his bread, broken and stale, and placed it into the stranger's shaking hands. He wrapped his only extra blanket around him and poured warm water into a cup. The stranger ate slowly, each bite an act of survival. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. He thanked Ion, over and over, as if words themselves were the only payment he could offer. Ion said nothing of sacrifice. He did not mention that the bread had been meant for morning, or that the blanket would leave him colder through the night. He believed that kindness spoken aloud lost its purity. He sat beside the fire, feeding it the last pieces of wood, watching the flames struggle and persist. As the hours passed, the storm showed no mercy. The fire eventually faded into embers, and the cold reclaimed the room. Ion wrapped his shawl tighter and leaned against the wall, his body aching, his stomach empty. His mother slept on, unaware of how thin the margin between survival and surrender had become. Exhaustion finally overtook him. When Ion awoke, silence filled the air. The storm had passed. Light filtered faintly through the small window, reflecting off snow piled high against the walls. For a moment, he felt peace. Then he remembered the stranger. He turned, expecting to see him asleep by the ashes of the fire. But the spot was empty. The blanket lay neatly folded. The cup was clean. Confusion filled him as he stood and searched the small house. There was no sign of the man. Then he noticed something else. On the floor where the stranger had rested lay a small pouch. Ion picked it up with trembling hands. Inside were gold coins, more than he had ever seen in his entire life. Beneath them was a simple note. It spoke of patience rewarded, of generosity seen even in the darkest storm, of trials sent not to break the faithful, but to reveal them. Ion's heart pounded as he read it again and again. He did not know who the stranger truly was, or why fate had chosen him for such a test. He only knew that his life had changed in a single night of ice and choice. Yet wealth did not transform him into a different man. It revealed who he had always been. Ion used the gold to secure food and medicine for his mother. He repaired his home, not into a mansion, but into a shelter strong enough to endure future winters. He invested in honest work, providing labor not only for himself but for others who struggled as he once had. The village watched in quiet disbelief as the poor man rose, not in arrogance, but in dignity. He did not boast. He did not hoard. He remembered the cold nights and empty stomachs too clearly to forget those still living them. His door remained open. His hearth remained shared. People asked him the secret of his fortune. He never spoke of gold or strangers. He spoke only of patience. Of choosing compassion when fear offers easier answers. Of believing that storms, no matter how violent, do not last forever. Years later, when winter returned and snow once again buried the valley, Ion would stand at his door, watching the wind dance across the white fields. He would remember that night. The hunger, the cold, the knock, and he would smile softly, knowing that the greatest victory of that storm was not the wealth it brought, but the proof that patience, when held firmly, can turn even the wrath of winter into mercy.